last video, I talked about my last academic paper. In this video, I will talk about my first academic paper, the very first paper that I ever published in a peer-reviewed journal. And I think academics have a very, or at least for me, I have a very special relationship with the very first paper. Not unlike the very first love, looking back, I still get some of the thrills that I felt then, even though in a certain sense I'm not there anymore and I have evolved. So I want to explain a bit what this paper was about, and also at the end I will say where I am now, what I still believe in, and what I tend to see differently. The paper is called Criticism Without Fundamental Principles, and it was published in a journal called Informal Logic. So let's start with the title. I think the title highlights a problem that we have to deal with and we have yet to solve, and that is it possible to be critical of someone or something or some forms of behavior or of institutions or of whole societies? Is it possible to be critical without at the same time, in order to be critical, assuming the truth and validity of some fundamental principles? There is notes somewhere, I think it's in Wittgenstein's Blue Book, where he says, well, you cannot open all doors at the same time. The meaning being that when you're critical of something, when you open one door, you inevitably leave some doors closed. In other words, you don't welcome criticism of the assumptions which you need in order to be critical of that which you're criticizing. So, criticism without fundamental principles is in fact the main question that we have to ask ourselves. Is it possible to have a mode, a variant of criticism where you are not committed to this or that fundamental principle? So, the first paragraph, I think, also highlights where I'm going with all this. I quote, "The assumption that some forms of argumentative discourse contravene established standards lies at the basis of many normative theories of argumentative discourse. Whether the standards are presented as standards of cognition, of communicative behavior, or of logic, the basic spur is the same, and it might be roughly formulated as not anything goes." So behind the scholar or the philosopher or just the regular man on the street being critical of someone else's argumentative behavior, so here I focused on argumentative behavior, but what I'm going to say about argumentative behavior applies to when you're critical of some other forms of behavior, or when you're critical of an artifact, or when you're critical of a technology, so on and so forth. When you're critical, the basic intuition, what I call here the basic spur, is that not anything goes. So some things go, some things are allowed, some things are substandard in some sense. And I continue. "It has been part of the explicit or implicit research agenda of the normatively oriented argumentation scholar to discover and formulate the standards that separate the good, that is rational, reasonable, etc., from the bad, fallacious, irrational, unreasonable, in argumentative reality." So the basic spur is, okay, some things are better than others, some things might be illicit in some sense, fallacious or irrational, and the job of the scholar is to, here I say, discover and formulate, well, discover, but maybe also invent and formulate, so come up with standards that separate this good from the bad. And these are the fundamental principles that I'm interested in. I continue. "Since the search for standards assumes the standard's existence and their discoverability, such an agenda can be characterized as being idealist. Now, I don't mean idealist in the way in which George Berkeley is an idealist, but I do mean to say that if you think that there are norms or fundamental principles of good reasoning or good argumentation out there, you are in a certain sense committed to their existence and their truth as separate from the argumentative reality. So you see, the main path that I want to criticize here is that what we need to do when we see that some things go and some things don't is to look for rules, is to look for fundamental principles. And further down, I highlight the fact that this step, these are two different observations. Not anything goes, and we need to formulate the rules. These are two different observations. And I think that the step from one to the other has been usually taken for granted, but I want to problematize that. So further down, I write, the step from the assumption that not anything goes to the idea that argumentative reality could and should be tamed by means of standards is a crucial one, and it deserves more attention. The central aim of the present paper is to re-examine this step. And then I go to a quote that I exploit in order to legitimize this. I found it in a paper, old paper even at that time, written by Govier, where she looks at the title of the paper is "What is a good argument?" So I thought, okay, if there's ever anywhere where I find this answer, then it's there. But at the end of the paper, at the very end, Govier remarks, we are so far from having an account of argument cogency which is reasonable, reliable, and efficient that we may have to re-examine the quest itself. And I highlight this. So this is the question that concerns me in this paper. How do you re-examine the quest for standards of good argumentation? She says cogent argumentation. How do you re-examine the quest itself? Is there maybe an alternative step from not anything goes to some other form of being critical? And this is it. This is the setup of the paper. And then I take a case in point, and that is the pragmadialectical theory of argumentation. I took this case in point because I knew the theory very well, having studied at the University of Amsterdam. But in a certain sense, the choice is more or less arbitrary, because what applies to what I say about the pragmadialectical theory can be said of other theories of good argumentative behavior or good argumentation. So I'm going to skip the details of this account. They're fairly technical, but there I show that this unproblematized step from not anything goes to, let's design a set of rules, leads to serious methodological problems. So it's not just a philosophical worry that you have to keep in the back of your head. The idea that that step is not very natural and maybe not legitimate leads to actual problems in you trying to devise codes of conduct and apply them. So if you're interested in the, let's say, the practical implications of this philosophical question, then you should go and read that part. It's the next two sections. So I end up then in a point where I have demonstrated by looking at the pragmadialectical theory that not that fast. It's not that easy to see that not anything goes, which an assumption we almost cannot shake off. We have to, and we need to, and we love to be critical about argumentative practice. And an assumption that is not that warranted, which is, okay, let's figure out what the rules are. And having arrived at this point, it is my job to say, okay, Mr. Smarty Pants, but how do you, what else is there? You know, how do you go, if not in this direction? So I pull certain strands and use them in this section 4, And most significantly, and I think this has remained with me one way or the other, is the idea that pluralism offers a certain, if not a counterpart, maybe a certain alternative to going up the mountain like Moses, or in the desert like Jesus Christ, and coming back with rules, coming back with codes of conduct. And I found it very endearing to see that I quote and I use the work of John Kekesh and Lassman, both of whom are Peter Lassman. They're now very good friends of mine, philosophically speaking. I don't know them personally, but I look towards pluralism to get us out of this mess where we have rules that don't work. And at the end of section, I'm not sure where we are right now, section 4, towards the end of section 4, I actually give a quote that I think I have always given ever since when talking about these things. So it's nice to look back and see, oh, this is where it all started. And it's the quote from Feierabend. I think it's, let me see, yeah, 1978. It's a book called Science in a Free Society. And it discusses this separation. The book discusses the separation between the rules, the fundamental principles that, you know, the theorists discover up the mountain or in the desert, and the practice, the messy, unruly, not anything goes practice. So it problematizes this distinction. And the quote goes like this: "For even the most perfect standards or rules are not independent of the material on which they act." So even though the rules are not about, in this case we're talking about rules of argumentative behavior, even those rules of argumentative behavior are not about this argumentative behavior or that argumentative behavior, they are not in some platonic universe outside this practice. This is what Feierabend means. Even the most perfect standards or rules are not independent of the material on which they act. And even the most, and then it turns around, he says, even the most disorderly practice is not without its regularities. In other words, and then you forget the rules and look at the practice, it's not like you cannot see some rules being followed and some regularities being formed. And the quote continues, and as such, we are brought to conclude that, and this is the bit that I almost always cite, what we call reason and practice are two different kinds of practices. And I find this to be such a beautiful, rhetorically speaking, such a beautiful quote. Forget about whether he's right or wrong. Well, you know, that remains to be decided. But I think it's one of those lines that you expect reason and practice are just two different kinds of, and you expect some higher order category. But then what comes is a bit fades down. It says reason and practice are just two different kinds of practices. In other words, the rules, the code of conduct, the 10 commandments that are brought down from the mountain, that's just a description of a different kind of practice. And other practices, whether the ones we observe and we want to be critical of, or other rules that other people have brought down from the mountains, from the mountaintop, other rules are themselves also a different kind of practice. And this is what I mean by pluralism when I say that I search for some answers in the philosophy of pluralism, because in some sense, then, there is an equality between these practices. Some practice, just because it's given as a set of rules that sound very serious, is not in and of itself better than others, even though you can say, well, it has these advantages. That practice will have had some other disadvantages, and because of that, there is this, what Michael Walzer calls, this complex equality between practices. The equality that arises when there's a lot of small inequalities and benefits and disadvantages between all these practices. Now, I want to mention one more author, because I think in a certain sense the development of this idea comes from him as well, and that is William Bartley and a book called The Retreat to Commitment. You see the idea that when you're being critical, you're not actually advancing and being offensive in the war-like sense of attacking something. You're actually retreating. You're saying, ooh, I love my rules, I love my commitments, I love my norms. It's, in essence, he's saying, well, when you're being critical, that's just a species of you being stubborn. You say, well, I see something that is different, and I'm not saying, well, let's come here, let's talk about it, let's see what these differences are. You're saying, no, that's against the rules. Remember, not anything goes. So I think it's important to mention William Bartley as well. And then in the rest of the paper, to wrap it up a bit, in the rest of the paper, I take a look at what exactly would mean to be critical from this pluralist perspective. These two terms pull in different directions. Pluralism pulls more towards tolerance and integration and synthesis, whereas criticism pulls more towards distinctions and differentiation and rejections and being critical, of course. So in the remaining of the paper, you can read it. I'll put the link in the description. I look at certain situations, look at certain examples where you would carry out this switch from a idealist perspective to what I call then a pluralist perspective. This is it. This is my first ever paper published. I hope you felt the enthusiasm that I felt again by just explaining a bit what I was trying to do. If you want to keep up with what I'm publishing on this channel, you can subscribe, and I'll see you at the next installment of these videos. Thank you very much.